My name is Elena Morrison. I'm 39 years old. I work in operations, one of those roles that sits quietly in the background, making sure everything functions the way it's supposed to. I don't lead meetings. I don't dominate conversations. I make systems work, problems disappear, and deadlines hold steady. And for most of my life, that's how people have seen me. Useful. Calm and largely interchangeable. In my family, I've always been the quiet constant, the one who adapts, the one who fills the gaps without being asked. I'm not the sibling people worry about or brag about. I don't create emergencies or excitement. And because I've never demanded space, I was slowly assigned a smaller and smaller one. My brother, especially, believed he understood exactly who I was. He was confident in a way that drew attention effortlessly. The kind of person who spoke first and expected agreement to follow. Over time, that confidence turned into a hierarchy he never questioned. One where he stood firmly at the center and I existed somewhere at the edge. Close enough to be useful, far enough to be dismissed. When he told me, casually and without hesitation, that I wasn't real family, it didn't come out of anger. It came out of certainty, as if he was stating a fact we'd both quietly accepted for years. I remember standing there, listening, and realizing something unsettling. Not that he believed it, but that he believed it so completely he didn't think it would hurt. This story isn't about that moment alone. It's about everything that came before it, and everything that followed. About how disrespect rarely arrives all at once. It seeps in slowly, disguised as jokes, assumptions, and expectations you're never asked to agree to, but are punished for refusing. Over time, I learned how to stay silent. Not out of fear, and not because I lacked words, but because silence gave me perspective. It allowed me to see patterns others were too loud to notice. It gave me distance. And eventually, it gave me a choice. I want to be clear about something before we go any further. This is not a story about revenge. There is no shouting match, no public humiliation, no dramatic victory scene. What happens instead is quieter and far more permanent. It's a story about boundaries forming where compliance once lived, about what happens when someone you've underestimated stops compensating for your blind spots. When my brother eventually hit rock bottom, emotionally, financially, professionally, the people he relied on vanished. The authority he assumed had dissolved, and the person he had dismissed for years became the only one left who truly understood how things worked. What followed wasn't satisfying in the way movies promise. It was sobering, grounded, human, and irreversible. I'm sharing this story for anyone who has ever been labeled low maintenance and slowly erased because of it. For anyone who has been treated as optional until the moment they were essential. This is a reflection on quiet strength, delayed recognition, and the cost of confusing silence with weakness. So before we continue, let me ask you, gently and without judgment. Have you ever been underestimated for so long that people forgot what would happen if you finally stepped back? To my family, I was never a problem. That sounds like a compliment, but it isn't. In our house, problems got attention. Problems were discussed, debated, and worried over. Problems were remembered. I, on the other hand, was smooth, quiet, self-contained. I handled things before they became visible, and because of that, I slowly became part of the background. Reliable, but easily overlooked. Growing up, my brother was the reference point. His achievements were announced. His mistakes were explained away. His moods set the temperature of the room. If he was happy, the house felt lighter. If he was angry, everyone adjusted. I learned early that my role was not to disrupt that balance, so I adapted. If there was tension, I softened it. If something was missing, I filled the gap. If plans changed, I adjusted mine without comment. Not because anyone explicitly told me to, but because it made things easier for everyone else. And when you're praised for being easy, you learn to make yourself smaller without realizing that's what you're doing. By the time we were adults, the dynamic was firmly set. My brother was seen as capable, ambitious, and deserving of investment. I was seen as stable, low risk, the one who would be fine no matter what. When relatives asked about us, the questions were different. He was asked where he was going. I was asked how things were going. It's a subtle distinction, but a powerful one. One assumes growth, the other assumes stasis. At family gatherings, I was the one who arrived early and stayed late. I helped in the kitchen. I remembered dietary restrictions. I noticed when someone felt left out and adjusted seating or conversation to pull them back in. None of it was acknowledged because none of it was dramatic. It was just expected. And expectations, once normalized, stop feeling like obligations. They start feeling like entitlements. I wasn't asked if I could help. I was told what would be helpful. I wasn't consulted about plans. I was informed of them. And I accepted it, because pushing back felt unnecessary. Because I told myself it didn't matter. Because I believed that being needed, even quietly, meant I belonged. But there's a difference between being needed and being valued. I see that now. I didn't. Then. To my brother, I was convenient, a constant, someone he could lean on without checking whether I was leaning back. He assumed my availability the way people assume electricity, always there, unnoticed until it's gone. He rarely asked how I was doing in any meaningful way, not because he was cruel, but because my emotional interior had never been relevant to him. I didn't protest. I didn't correct him. I didn't demand recognition. I told myself I was choosing peace. I told myself I didn't need validation. And for a long time, that felt true. But invisibility has a cost. When you're consistently underestimated, people stop seeing your limits. They stop noticing your contributions. They start believing that what you give costs you nothing. And eventually, they rewrite the story in their own minds, that you are simply less ambitious, less important, less real. That's how my brother came to believe I wasn't real family. Not because I wasn't present, but because I was always present. I never made my presence conditional. I never withdrew it. I never let him experience what life looked like without my quiet support holding things together. And so in his mind, I became part of the structure, not a person within it. At the time, I didn't label this as disrespect. I didn't name it. I didn't even feel angry. I felt neutral, slightly tired, slightly detached, like someone who has been standing too long and doesn't realize their legs are numb. I thought this was just how families worked, that someone had to be the stable one, the invisible one, the one who didn't ask for much. What I didn't understand yet was this. Roles that are assigned without consent are rarely harmless. And the longer you stay silent inside them, the harder it becomes for others to imagine you any other way. The first time my brother said it out loud, it wasn't during an argument. That's what stayed with me. There was no raised voice, no tension in the room, no dramatic build-up. We were standing in the kitchen after a family dinner, plates stacked, the smell of food still lingering. Someone, an aunt, I think, had made a comment about how family should always stick together. How blood was everything. My brother laughed lightly, the way people do when they think they're being honest, not hurtful. Well, he said, glancing at me without really looking. Elena's different. She's not real family in that sense. She's more like support. Support! The word landed softly, almost politely. No one reacted. No one challenged him. A few people smiled awkwardly, as if he'd made a slightly inappropriate joke. And then the conversation moved on. I remember standing there, hands still wet from washing dishes, feeling a brief, sharp awareness, like a paper cut you don't see until it stings. Small, precise, easy to ignore if you wanted to. So I ignored it. I told myself he hadn't meant it the way it sounded, that he was just speaking carelessly, that everyone knew what he really meant. I told myself it wasn't worth addressing, because addressing it would make things uncomfortable. And I had spent most of my life learning how to absorb discomfort quietly, so others wouldn't have to. But even as I smiled and nodded, something shifted. Not outwardly. Nothing changed in the way anyone treated me that night. I was still thanked for helping, still included in plans, still relied upon. But internally, a small marker dropped into place. A line drawn, faint but permanent. Because what struck me wasn't just the statement, it was the certainty behind it. He hadn't checked to see how I'd react. He hadn't softened it or walked it back. He'd spoken as if he were naming a truth everyone already understood. And maybe, in his mind, they did. I started noticing things after that. How he introduced me to people, not as his sister, but by my usefulness. She helps me with logistics. She keeps things organized. Never. This is Elena. Always a function, never a relationship. How decisions were made around me, not with me. How was my agreement assumed? My presence was optional when it came to celebration, but mandatory when it came to responsibility. None of these things was new. That was the unsettling part. They had been happening for years. But once that first small cut was made, I couldn't unsee the pattern. I couldn't go back to believing it was accidental. Still, I didn't confront him. Part of me thought that naming it would give it too much power. Another part believed, honestly, that this was just the price of being the dependable one. That closeness came in different forms, and mine just happened to look like service. So I stayed quiet. Outwardly, nothing changed. I continued to help, continued to show up, continued to smooth things over when my brother's confidence tipped into entitlement. I even found myself compensating more, anticipating needs earlier, solving problems faster, as if excellence might quietly correct the narrative. It didn't. If anything, it reinforced it. Because when someone benefits from your silence, they rarely question it. They don't wonder whether you're okay. They don't ask whether you agree. They just adjust their expectations upward and keep going. That was the real cut, not the words themselves, but the realization that no one had felt the need to defend me. Not because they were cruel, but because they were comfortable. And comfort, when built on someone else's invisibility, is hard to disrupt. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone for a long time. Not crying, not angry, just still. Turning the word over in my mind. Support. I asked myself a question I'd never asked before. If I stopped being useful, what would be left? I didn't have an answer yet, but the question stayed with me. Quiet, persistent, waiting. And once a question like that takes root, it changes the way you listen to everything that comes after. After that night, nothing dramatic happened. There was no fallout, no apology, no moment where my brother realized he'd gone too far. Life continued exactly as it had before, which in a way was the point. Disrespect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it survives because it blends in so well with routine that it feels like nothing at all. I went back to being useful. If anything, I became more efficient. I answered messages faster. I anticipated needs before they were voiced. I kept everything running smoothly, the way I always had. And because I never changed my behavior, everyone else assumed nothing had changed inside me either. That's how normalization works. The comments continued, small and almost casual. My brother would joke about how I didn't really have a life outside work anyway. He'd volunteer my time to help with things without asking first. He'd talk over me in group conversations, then later ask me to clarify something privately, as if my voice was only meant to be used in the background. Each moment on its own felt too minor to address, too petty, too easy to explain away. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself he was stressed, busy, unaware. I told myself that families tease each other, that this was normal, that pushing back would only create unnecessary conflict. And beneath all of those justifications was a quieter belief I didn't want to examine too closely, that maintaining harmony was more important than being seen. So I stayed in my lane. I listened more than I spoke. I smiled at the remarks that landed a second too hard. I took on tasks without acknowledgement and told myself that competence was its own reward. I watched as my brother's sense of entitlement expanded, not dramatically but steadily, like a room filling with water one slow inch at a time. What I didn't realize then was that by normalizing his behavior, I was teaching him something. I was teaching him that access to me was unconditional, that my support didn't require respect, that he could minimize me without consequence. And people learn very quickly what they can get away with. There was a moment, small but revealing, when I tried to assert myself. We were discussing plans that involved a significant commitment of my time. I mentioned, calmly, that I might not be able to take it on this time. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply stated a limit. My brother looked genuinely surprised. Not angry, not offended, just confused, as if a piece of furniture had spoken. "Well," he said slowly, "that's not like you." And that was it. No follow-up question, no curiosity about why, just a subtle expectation that I would correct myself, return to form, Restore the version of me that made things easier. So I did. I smiled and said I'd figure it out. That moment haunted me more than the original comment ever had, because it revealed how firmly my role had been defined, not by my brother alone, but by my own consistency. I had been so reliable that deviation felt like a malfunction. From then on, I stopped trying to test the boundaries. Instead, I observed. I noticed how my brother reacted when other people said no to him, how he negotiated, persuaded, adjusted, how he respected resistance when it came from someone he considered an equal. And I noticed how different his response was with me, how he skipped straight past negotiation into assumption. That contrast was impossible to ignore. Still, I didn't confront him. Not because I lacked courage, but because something in me had shifted. The desire to explain myself had faded. In its place was a growing clarity. If he couldn't see me after all this time, words weren't going to fix that. So I let the pattern continue. On the surface, I remained the same Elena, calm, helpful, uncomplaining. But internally, I began to detach. Not emotionally, I still cared, but strategically. I stopped giving my full attention to moments that drained me. I started conserving energy. I started noticing where my effort went and what came back in return. Disrespect, once normalized, becomes invisible to the people benefiting from it. But for the person living inside it, it accumulates. Not as anger, not as resentment, but as distance. And distance, once it forms, is very hard to reverse. By the time I understood the role I'd been given, I was already performing it perfectly. I was the backup plan, the stabilizer, the one who absorbed overflow without complaint. In my family's unspoken system, I wasn't a decision maker or a priority. I was infrastructure, useful precisely because I didn't require maintenance. No one sat me down and explained this role. It emerged naturally, reinforced by repetition. Every time something went wrong, I was looped in. Every time something went right, I faded into the background. Reliability, I learned, makes people stop checking in. My brother relied on me in ways he never acknowledged. He leaned on my organizational skills, my attention to detail, and my ability to hold information without broadcasting it. He assumed I'd be available to proofread, to coordinate, to smooth things over with others when his confidence rubbed them the wrong way. And because I did those things well, he began to see them not as favors, but as features, like they came built in. When decisions were made, I was informed after the fact. When credit was given, it traveled upward, never sideways. I wasn't excluded out of malice. I was excluded because my presence wasn't required for validation. I already belonged to the outcome, just not the recognition. The realization came slowly, then all at once. I noticed how often my brother said, "You don't mind, right?" Already moving forward before I could answer. I noticed how my time was treated as flexible, my boundaries as negotiable. I noticed how my needs were framed as inconveniences, while his were treated as inevitabilities. And still, I stayed calm, because calm was expected of me. Calm was my brand. If I showed frustration, it was met with surprise. If I expressed fatigue, it was brushed aside. The version of me they wanted was endlessly capable and emotionally neutral. Any deviation felt like a breach of contract I hadn't known I'd signed. What hurt wasn't the workload, it was the invisibility of choice. I hadn't chosen this role consciously. I had slid into it by being agreeable, by solving problems before they escalated, by not making my needs urgent. And over time, those traits were reinterpreted as limitations. I wasn't seen as generous. I was seen as having less to offer elsewhere. That's how people justify taking from you. My brother, in particular, spoke about me as if I were static, as if my life had reached its final form. He talked about my work as something I did to stay busy. He spoke about my availability as if it were permanent. He never asked what I wanted next, because he had already decided it wasn't relevant. And I let him. Not because I agreed, but because I was watching. There's a moment when you realize you've been placed in a box, where you have two options. You can fight the label loudly, demand re-evaluation, and insist on being seen differently. Or you can study the box, its shape, its limits, and the assumptions holding it in place. I chose the second. I stopped trying to change how I was perceived. Instead, I paid attention to what that perception allowed me to do. I noticed how little scrutiny I was under, how freely people spoke around me, assuming I wasn't really listening, how much access I had simply by being safe. The role I'd been assigned, reliable, invisible, non-threatening, came with a strange kind of freedom. Because when no one sees you as a player, they stop guarding the board. My brother, especially, never considered that I might be paying attention to the systems he depended on, that I might understand the timelines, the obligations, the pressure points better than he did. He assumed that, because I didn't challenge him, I couldn't. That assumption wasn't his mistake alone. It was built on years of evidence I had helped provide. But roles can change, quietly, internally, long before anyone else notices, and that's exactly what was happening. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no moment where I finally said everything I'd been holding back. If anything, the day felt almost disappointingly ordinary, and maybe that's why it stayed with me, because nothing external marked it as important. I was sitting alone at my kitchen table, early in the morning, reviewing a set of documents for work. The light was soft, grey, the kind that makes everything feel suspended. My phone buzzed with a message from my brother, a request, framed casually, as usual. He needed me to take care of something time-sensitive, again. Normally, I would have replied immediately, asked clarifying questions, started solving the problem before fully reading the details. That was my reflex. That morning, I didn't. I read the message once, then again. And instead of the familiar sense of obligation, I felt something else. Distance. Not anger, not resentment, just a quiet awareness that I had a choice. I put the phone down. For the first time in years, I let the silence stretch. I made coffee. I finished reviewing my own work. I noticed how my body felt, how tired I actually was, how often I'd been operating on autopilot. And in that stillness, something clicked. I realized that my brother's confidence in my availability wasn't based on trust or closeness. It was based on consistency, on my track record of never pushing back, on the assumption that I would always absorb the impact so he wouldn't have to. That realization didn't make me angry. It made it clear. I finally understood that nothing was going to change unless I changed first. Not my tone, not my explanations, my behavior. So I replied, calmly, briefly. I can't take that on today. No apology, no justification, no alternative offered. When his response came, it was immediate, confused, slightly irritated. He asked why, as if the reason mattered more than the boundary itself, as if my availability was something he could audit. I didn't explain. That was the shift. Not because I said no, but because I didn't rush to make my no acceptable. The rest of the day passed without incident, but something fundamental had altered. I felt it in the way I moved through tasks, the way I prioritized my own deadlines, the way I stopped scanning for what needed fixing next. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. My brother relied on me in ways he never acknowledged. He leaned on my organizational skills, my attention to detail, and my ability to hold information without broadcasting it. He assumed I'd be available to proofread, to coordinate, to smooth things over with others when his confidence rubbed them the wrong way. And because I did those things well, he began to see them not as favors, but as features, like they came built in. When decisions were made, I was informed after the fact. When credit was given, it traveled upward, never sideways. I wasn't excluded out of malice. I was excluded because my presence wasn't required for validation. I already belonged to the outcome, just not the recognition. The realization came slowly, then all at once. I noticed how often my brother said, "You don't mind, right?" Already moving forward before I could answer. I noticed how my time was treated as flexible, my boundaries as negotiable. I noticed how my needs were framed as inconveniences, while his were treated as inevitabilities. And still, I stayed calm, because calm was expected of me. Calm was my brand. If I showed frustration, it was met with surprise. If I expressed fatigue, it was brushed aside. The version of me they wanted was endlessly capable and emotionally neutral. Any deviation felt like a breach of contract I hadn't known I'd signed. What hurt wasn't the workload, it was the invisibility of choice. I hadn't chosen this role consciously. I had slid into it by being agreeable, by solving problems before they escalated, by not making my needs urgent. And over time, those traits were reinterpreted as limitations. I wasn't seen as generous. I was seen as having less to offer elsewhere. That's how people justify taking from you. My brother, in particular, spoke about me as if I were static, as if my life had reached its final form. He talked about my work as something I did to stay busy. He spoke about my availability as if it were permanent. He never asked what I wanted next, because he had already decided it wasn't relevant. And I let him. Not because I agreed, but because I was watching. There's a moment when you realize you've been placed in a box where you have two options. You can fight the label loudly, demand reevaluation, and insist on being seen differently. Or you can study the box, its shape, its limits, and the assumptions holding it in place. I chose the second. I stopped trying to change how I was perceived. Instead, I paid attention to what that perception allowed me to do. I noticed how little scrutiny I was under, how freely people spoke around me, assuming I wasn't really listening, how much access I had simply by being safe. The role I'd been assigned, reliable, invisible, non-threatening, came with a strange kind of freedom. Because when no one sees you as a player, they stop guarding the board. My brother, especially, never considered that I might be paying attention to the systems he depended on, that I might understand the timelines, the obligations, the pressure points better than he did. He assumed that because I didn't challenge him, I couldn't. That assumption wasn't his mistake alone. It was built on years of evidence I had helped provide. But roles can change, quietly, internally, long before anyone else notices. And that's exactly what was happening. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no moment where I finally said everything I'd been holding back. If anything, the day felt almost disappointingly ordinary. And maybe that's why it stayed with me, because nothing external marked it as important. I was sitting alone at my kitchen table, early in the morning, reviewing a set of documents for work. The light was soft, grey, the kind that makes everything feel suspended. My phone buzzed with a message from my brother. A request, framed casually as usual. He needed me to take care of something time-sensitive, again. Normally, I would have replied immediately, asked clarifying questions, started solving the problem before fully reading the details. That was my reflex. That morning, I didn't. I read the message once, then again. And instead of the familiar sense of obligation, I felt something else. Distance, not anger, not resentment, just a quiet awareness that I had a choice. I put the phone down. For the first time in years, I let the silence stretch. I made coffee. I finished reviewing my own work. I noticed how my body felt, how tired I actually was, how often I'd been operating on autopilot. And in that stillness, something clicked. I realized that my brother's confidence in my availability wasn't based on trust or closeness. It was based on consistency, on my track record of never pushing back, on the assumption that I would always absorb the impact so he wouldn't have to. That realization didn't make me angry. It made it clear. I finally understood that nothing was going to change unless I changed first. Not my tone, not my explanations, my behavior. So I replied, calmly, briefly, I can't take that on today. No apology, no justification, no alternative offered. When his response came, it was immediate, confused, slightly irritated. He asked why, as if the reason mattered more than the boundary itself, as if my availability was something he could audit. I didn't explain. That was the shift. Not because I said no, but because I didn't rush to make my no acceptable. The rest of the day passed without incident, but something fundamental had altered. I felt it in the way I moved through tasks, the way I prioritized my own deadlines, the way I stopped scanning for what needed fixing next. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was tuning. In the days that followed, I didn't announce any changes. I didn't give speeches or set new rules. I simply became less predictable. I responded when I was able, not when I was expected to. I offered help when it made sense, not when it was assumed, and I watched. My brother noticed, of course, not consciously at first, just small comments. "You've been busy lately. You're hard to reach." Observations disguised as jokes, signals that the pattern he relied on was slipping. I didn't correct him. I didn't reassure him. I let the discomfort sit where it belonged. What surprised me most wasn't his reaction. It was mine. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel selfish. I felt steady, like I'd finally adjusted my posture after years of standing wrong. I had always been good at holding information, without reacting to it, at noticing patterns without announcing them, understanding systems not from the top down, but from the inside out. Those skills hadn't appeared overnight. They were the result of years spent being overlooked, and now they mattered. I began organizing what I already knew, not out of spite, but out of responsibility, to myself. I reviewed timelines, dependencies, and obligations. I documented processes that existed only in people's heads. I made note of which relationships actually sustained outcomes and which were just noise. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't ask probing questions. I let people keep talking. My brother, in particular, had no idea how much of his world I understood. He spoke freely around me, venting frustrations, outlining plans that relied heavily on assumptions. He treated complexity as something that could be handled later, trusting that momentum would carry him through. And because I had always been the one smoothing those complexities behind the scenes, he believed they would continue to resolve themselves. They didn't. But before that became obvious, I needed clarity. So I learned. I deepened my understanding of the systems he relied on: financial structures, contractual obligations, operational timelines. I consulted professionals quietly, not to act, but to understand. I asked neutral questions. I verified details. I made sure I wasn't reacting emotionally or prematurely. This wasn't about leverage in the sense of power over someone. It was about agency, about no longer operating in the dark. And the more I learned, the clearer it became. My brother's stability was fragile. Not because he was incompetent, but because he was overconfident. He relied on informal support structures and unspoken agreements. He assumed continuity where there was none. He believed that relationships would hold simply because they always had. He hadn't planned for absence. What he also hadn't planned for was me seeing the full picture. The irony is that I'd always been capable of this level of understanding. I just hadn't needed to use it before. My efforts had been spent maintaining equilibrium, not questioning it. Now, with my silence creating space, that energy went elsewhere. I didn't feel empowered in the way people often describe. There was no surge of confidence or sense of superiority. What I felt was grounded, calm, like someone finally standing on solid ground after years of shifting weight unconsciously. I also felt responsibility, because once you see how something really works, you can't unsee it. You can't pretend ignorance for the sake of comfort. You have to decide what you're going to do with that knowledge, and that decision takes time. I didn't rush it. I watched as small cracks appeared in my brother's life. Missed deadlines, strained conversations, increased stress. He began reaching out more, not for help exactly, but for reassurance, for confirmation that things were still under control. I didn't give it, not because I wanted him to fail, but because false reassurance would have been another form of compensation, another way of protecting him from reality. Instead, I stayed neutral. Present, but not propping things up. What he never noticed was that the ground beneath him had always been reinforced by my quiet effort, and now that reinforcement was gone. I also noticed something else, something that surprised me. As my focus shifted inward, my own life began to expand. I had more time, more mental clarity, more energy. I started investing in my own stability, my own future, in ways I had postponed for years because there was always something else that needed my attention. That contrast was stark. While my brother's world grew more chaotic, mine became more ordered. Not because I was doing anything extraordinary, but because I was no longer distributing my capacity unevenly. Preparation, I learned, doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like patience, like restraint, like letting things unfold without intervening. By the time my brother realized something was wrong, It was already too late to pretend nothing had changed, and by then, I was no longer just observing. I was ready to choose. The moment of clarity didn't come with relief, it came with stillness. I was sitting alone again, this time not at my kitchen table, but in a small, quiet office I'd borrowed for an hour. Papers spread out in front of me, notes I'd organized over weeks, timelines aligned, assumptions tested. For the first time, everything was visible at once, and the picture was unmistakable. My brother wasn't standing on solid ground. He was balancing on momentum, on habits, on unspoken agreements, on people filling in gaps he didn't even know existed. My absence hadn't created the instability, it had revealed it. That distinction mattered to me, because it meant I wasn't responsible for what was coming. I hadn't caused the fault lines, I had simply stopped absorbing the pressure. What I discovered privately was not a single piece of leverage, but a convergence. Multiple points where his life relied on continuity rather than structure, where delays compounded quietly, where a lack of documentation, oversight, or contingency planning had been masked by confidence, and where I, historically, had been the contingency. Seeing it laid out so clearly was sobering. There was no urge to celebrate, no sense of triumph, just a calm understanding that the dynamic between us had been fundamentally unbalanced for a long time, and that imbalance was no longer sustainable. I also saw my own position with equal clarity. I wasn't powerless. I had been. I had simply been miscast, and had accepted the casting because it felt easier than challenging the script. But the skills I'd developed in the margins were real, valuable, and, importantly, voluntary. That was the private reveal. Not that I held power over my brother, but that I finally held power over myself. With that realization came responsibility. I had choices now, real ones. I could step back entirely and let things unravel. I could step in selectively, on new terms, or I could attempt to restore the old balance and pretend none of this had happened. Only one of those options was reversible. I took time to sit with that. I considered the implications, not just for him, but for me, for the kind of person I wanted to be moving forward, for the boundaries I was willing to enforce, and the ones I was no longer willing to compromise. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to be proven right. I didn't even want an apology, if I'm honest. What I wanted was alignment between how I was treated and how I showed up. That meant accepting something difficult, that helping my brother in the same way I always had would be a form of self-erasure, and refusing to help at all would be a form of avoidance. There was a third option, a harder one, to help without disappearing, but that option required something I'd never demanded before. Acknowledgement. Not praise, not gratitude, recognition of agency, of choice, of limits. And I knew, instinctively, that my brother was not ready for that conversation. Not yet. He was still operating on an assumption, still believing that things would resolve themselves, still expecting that if he waited long enough, I would step in and stabilize everything quietly, the way I always had. He didn't know that the conditions had changed, and I wasn't going to rush to inform him, because awareness has to land when someone is capable of receiving it. Too early, and it feels like an attack. Too late, and it feels like abandonment. Timing matters. So I waited. I let events continue on their trajectory. I let consequences accumulate without interference, not as punishment, but as information. And in that waiting, something else happened. I felt steady. For the first time, my sense of self wasn't tethered to how useful I was to someone else. It wasn't shaped by anticipation or reaction. It was grounded in choice. That grounding gave me clarity. When the moment came, and I knew it would, I wouldn't be reacting from hurt or anger. I would be responding from alignment. The private reveal wasn't about discovering my brother's weakness. It was about discovering my own threshold. And once you know where that line is, you stop crossing it. Even for family. The decision didn't announce itself as a turning point. There was no dramatic countdown, no single event that forced my hand. Instead, it arrived gradually, through accumulation of missed calls, of mounting pressure, of a tone shift in my brother's messages that moved from casual to strained. He was running out of margin. I could hear it in the way he spoke. Less certainty, more urgency, requests framed as updates, then as check-ins, then finally as appeals. He still hadn't asked directly for help, not in a way that acknowledged choice. He was circling the idea, hoping the old pattern would reassert itself. It didn't. And that's when I understood that waiting was no longer neutral. Continuing to observe without deciding would itself become a decision, one that allowed things to collapse without clarity. So I sat down and named my options honestly. The first was the familiar one. Step in quietly, fix what I could, smooth the edges, restore equilibrium. Say nothing, ask for nothing, return to invisibility. It would be efficient. It would be comfortable for everyone but me. The second was withdrawal, complete disengagement. Let him handle the consequences of his assumptions alone. Protect myself fully, but at the cost of any possibility of repair. The third option sat uncomfortably between them. Engagement, with conditions. Not demands, not ultimatums, conditions. Acknowledgement of my agency, transparency, clear boundaries around what I would and wouldn't take on. No more implied access, no more silent compensation. This option scared me the most. Not because it was risky, but because it required me to be seen. And being seen, after years of invisibility, can feel more threatening than being ignored. I asked myself a hard question. If I help him now, will I be reinforcing the same dynamic or redefining it? The answer depended entirely on how I entered the situation. I decided then that if I stepped in, it would be as myself, not as infrastructure. That meant waiting until he asked. Not indirectly, not through hints or frustration, directly. It took longer than I expected. Pride has momentum. Assumptions are hard to dismantle, but eventually, the noise gave way to necessity. The message came late one evening. Short, stripped of confidence. I need to talk. Can you help me? I didn't respond immediately. Not to punish him, but to check myself, to make sure I wasn't reacting from habit, to ensure that when I did answer, it would be intentional. When I replied, I didn't say yes. I said, "We can talk." That distinction mattered. The conversation that followed was restrained, careful. He outlined the situation in the broad strokes, still minimizing, still avoiding specifics, still hoping I'd fill in the gaps the way I always had. I didn't. I listened, I asked questions, I let the silence stretch, and slowly the shape of his problem became undeniable, even to him. He was at rock bottom, though he didn't use those words. He was out of options, though he framed it as a temporary difficulty. The confidence that once carried him was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar. Vulnerability. That was the real decision point. Not whether to help, but how. I told him I could assist, but not the way I used to. I didn't list grievances. I didn't revisit old comments. I simply stated what had changed. I can't be the default anymore, I said. If I'm involved, it's because we've agreed on how. He was quiet. Not angry, not defensive, just still. Processing the idea that the person he'd dismissed was now setting terms. That moment, quiet, unremarkable on the surface, was irreversible. Because once you name your agency out loud, you can't pretend it doesn't exist. Whatever came next, the old dynamic was over, and we both knew it. After that conversation, nothing changed publicly. That was intentional. There were no announcements, no visible shifts in posture or tone. To anyone watching from the outside, my brother's life looked the same. He still showed up, still spoke with confidence, still acted as if things were under control, and I let that impression stand. Real change rarely needs an audience. What changed happened quietly, behind the scenes, in the way I engaged, and more importantly, in the way I didn't. I agreed to help, but only within the boundaries I'd set. I didn't take over, I didn't rush ahead, I didn't fill in the missing pieces without asking. I asked for documentation, for timelines, for clarity. I made him articulate things he'd always assumed would resolve themselves. At first, this frustrated him. He wasn't used to explaining his reasoning to me, he wasn't used to being questioned, and he certainly wasn't used to slowing down to make sure things were sound before moving forward. But he complied, because he had no alternative. That was the quiet leverage, not control, but necessity. I also made changes on my end. I separated what I was willing to do from what I was expected to do. I documented everything. I clarified the scope. I set limits on availability. These weren't dramatic moves, they were procedural, boring even, but they were irreversible, because once expectations are written down, they stop being flexible in only one direction. I noticed something during this period that confirmed I was doing the right thing. My brother began to take responsibility, for real responsibility, not performative confidence. He double-checked assumptions. He asked questions instead of dismissing them. He stopped relying on last-minute fixes and started planning for contingencies. It wasn't gratitude that drove this change. It was exposure. Without my silence cushioning him, he had to confront the full weight of his decisions. And without my invisibility, he had to acknowledge where the work was actually happening. Still, I didn't seek recognition. I stayed quiet, focused, methodical. Moving in silence wasn't about secrecy. It was about refusing to center myself in a story that wasn't about validation. I didn't need my brother or anyone else to suddenly see me differently. I needed the structure to change, and the structure was changing. Slowly, the pressure stabilized. Deadlines were met. Crises were contained. Not because I swooped in heroically, but because I insisted on sustainability, because I refused to carry more than my share. To the outside world, it looked like my brother had recovered his footing. His confidence returned, not the old kind, fueled by assumption, but a quieter, more cautious version. People assumed he'd handled things himself. I let them, because the goal was never to expose him. It was to expose the dynamic. And the most important part of that work was internal. I felt different. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just aligned. My time was my own again. My energy was no longer being siphoned off invisibly. I could contribute without disappearing. That alignment changed how I moved through every other part of my life. I was clearer, more deliberate, less reactive. I stopped volunteering for roles that replicated the same imbalance. And something else shifted too. My brother began to treat me differently. Not with warmth or apology, not yet, but with caution, with attention, with the awareness that access to me was no longer guaranteed. That awareness mattered more than any words could have, because respect doesn't always arrive as an apology. Sometimes it arrives as a restraint. I continued to move quietly, reinforcing boundaries through consistency rather than confrontation. I didn't need to announce that the old version of me was gone. My actions made that clear. And while things appeared stable on the surface, the deeper consequences were still unfolding, the kind that only become visible once it's too late to reverse them. Consequences rarely arrive all at once. They come in increments, small adjustments that seem harmless on their own, but collectively change the shape of a life. That's what began to happen once I stopped absorbing the overflow. At first, my brother believed the crisis had passed. The immediate pressure eased, the most visible problems were contained. From his perspective, things were back on track. He resumed his usual pace, his familiar confidence, assuming that the system, whatever that meant, had stabilized. But the system hadn't. It had changed. Without my invisible compensation, the margin for error was thinner. There was less room for improvisation, fewer buffers protecting him from miscalculation. And while nothing collapsed dramatically, things began to strain in subtle, persistent ways. Deadlines that used to be flexible became fixed. Relationships that had tolerated inconsistency became less forgiving. People started asking for clarity instead of accepting assurances. The environment was no longer bending around him. He felt it before he understood it. I could see the tension returning to his posture, the careful way he chose words he used to toss around freely. He worked longer hours but got less done. He was reacting again, instead of steering. And this time, there was no one quietly steering for him. The most difficult part, for both of us, was that he couldn't name what was wrong. From his perspective, I was still helping. I hadn't withdrawn entirely. I hadn't abandoned him. So why did everything feel harder? The answer was simple. I was no longer overfunctioning. But overfunctioning, when normalized, becomes invisible. And when it stops, it feels like a loss, even though nothing was ever promised. I watched him grapple with this confusion without stepping in to explain it away. That was important, because the instinct to rescue, to soften the lesson, to spare him discomfort, was still there in me. But I had learned that shielding someone from consequences only delays growth. It doesn't prevent harm, it just redirects it. And for years, that harm had been redirected onto me. Now it wasn't. The consequences also began to surface in our relationship. He became more cautious around me, less dismissive. He asked before assuming. Not always, but more often. And when I said no, he didn't push as hard. He was learning slowly that resistance wasn't temporary, but with that learning came discomfort. He struggled with the loss of certainty, with the realization that the version of me he'd relied on, quiet, endlessly available, unquestioning, was no longer accessible, and that loss unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. There was a moment, during a tense conversation, when he almost named it. "You've changed," he said, not accusingly this time, more like an observation. "I have," I replied. I didn't elaborate. I didn't justify it. I didn't reassure him that things would go back to normal, because this was the new normal. The consequences weren't punitive. They weren't designed to teach him a lesson. They were simply the natural result of a system recalibrating after years of imbalance. And recalibration is uncomfortable. What surprised me most was how much lighter I felt. Not because his life was harder, but because mine was no longer being quietly sacrificed to make his easier. I had energy again, mental space, the ability to invest in my own future without constant interruption. That clarity came with resolve. I knew that if I wavered now, if I stepped back into old patterns out of guilt or nostalgia, I would undo everything. Not just for him, but for myself. So I stayed consistent. And consistency, when it replaces accommodation, reshapes relationships whether people like it or not. My brother was beginning to understand that. But understanding doesn't always arrive before regret. Sometimes it comes after. The panic didn't look the way I expected it to. There was no dramatic breakdown, no frantic phone calls in the middle of the night. What I saw instead was something quieter and far more revealing. A slow unraveling of certainty, a growing urgency behind my brother's words that he could no longer mask with confidence. By the time he realized how much had changed, the old fixes no longer worked. He tried to move faster, thinking speed would solve what structure couldn't. He tried to reassert authority, leaning on relationships that had once bent around him. But those relationships had adjusted, just like he had, only in a different direction. People expected clarity now, accountability, follow-through. The room for improvisation was gone. I noticed it in the way he spoke to me. Fewer assumptions, more care. He chose his words, as if trying to reverse engineer the past, searching for the moment where things had gone off course. But there was no single moment to point to. That was the hardest part for him to accept. He asked questions that circled the truth without landing on it. When did this start? Why does everything feel harder? What am I missing? Each question carried an unspoken hope that there was a simple fix, a lever he could pull to restore the old balance. There wasn't, because the old balance had depended on something he could no longer access, my unexamined compliance. And once compliance becomes conscious, it doesn't come back. I could see the regret forming, not sharp or immediate, but dull and persistent. He began to replay conversations in his mind, searching for clues. Moments where he might have gone too far, words that had landed heavier than he realized at the time. The comment about real family resurfaced, though he never mentioned it directly. I could tell by the way he hesitated around certain phrases, the way he avoided language that framed me as secondary or supportive. It was too late. Not too late for repair, but too late to undo what had been revealed. He tried, in his own way, to smooth things over. He was kinder, more attentive, occasionally even deferential, but these gestures came without acknowledgement, without naming what had changed or why, and without that, they felt provisional. Like temporary adjustments made in response to pressure, not understanding. I didn't reject his efforts. I accepted them at face value. But I didn't meet them with relief. I met them with steadiness. Because what I needed wasn't better behavior, it was a different foundation. At one point, he asked me directly, "Is this how it's going to be now?" The question wasn't angry, it wasn't defensive, it was tired. I took my time before answering. "This is how I need it to be," I said. That was the moment it landed, not as a threat, not as a demand, as a boundary that wasn't going to move. He nodded slowly, and in that nod, was the understanding that something fundamental had been lost. Not my help, but the version of me he'd taken for granted. You can't fix what you never fully acknowledged, and you can't return to a dynamic once one person has outgrown it. What followed wasn't dramatic. It was an adjustment. Grief, in a quiet form. The kind that comes when you realize the past you're nostalgic for depended on someone else carrying weight you never noticed. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt resolved. Because by then, I knew that even if he apologized, even if he named every misstep perfectly, it wouldn't change my posture. The work I'd done internally couldn't be undone by words. The door to my silence as obligation was closed. What remained open was choice. And that, finally, was mutual. The reversal didn't come with an announcement. There was no moment where my brother suddenly acknowledged everything. No grand apology, no dramatic confession. What happened instead was quieter, and in many ways, more decisive. He stopped assuming I would be there. At first, I thought it was distance, a withdrawal born from discomfort. But over time, I realized it was something else, recalibration. He was learning how to operate in a world where my presence was no longer a given. That shift changed everything. Decisions were made without looping me in for validation. Plans were built with contingencies that didn't include my quiet intervention. He began to carry the weight of outcomes instead of redistributing them. And the strange thing was, he didn't collapse. He struggled. He stumbled. But he adapted. That was the final reversal. For years, he had believed, consciously or not, that I was an accessory to his stability. My role was to smooth, absorb, and compensate. And I had believed, just as quietly, that stepping back would cause damage. It didn't. What it caused was growth. Not just for him, but for me. Because the real reversal wasn't about power changing hands. It was about responsibility returning to its rightful place. I noticed the change most clearly in how he spoke about me to others. Before, I had been referenced vaguely. She helps out. She's good at handling things. Always supportive, always peripheral. Now, when my name came up, it was with specificity, with acknowledgement, sometimes even with a pause, as if he were choosing his words carefully. I wasn't an extension of his life anymore. I was a person adjacent to it. That distinction mattered more than any apology ever could. Our interactions became simpler, less loaded. We spoke when there was something to say, not because expectation demanded it. When I helped, it was requested and received with clarity. And when I didn't, it wasn't questioned. That was the quiet dominance, not control, not superiority, just self-possession, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself to be felt. I could see him grappling with the implications, with the realization that the version of himself he'd built, confident, decisive, self-made, had relied more heavily on unseen support than he'd allowed himself to admit. That realization didn't diminish him. It matured him. And it liberated me. The dynamic that once defined us no longer existed. In its place was something leaner, more honest, less comforting perhaps, but real. I no longer measured my worth by how indispensable I was. I measured it by how free I felt. And that freedom changed the trajectory of my life. I began investing time where it actually returned something. I pursued goals that had once felt indulgent or impractical. I built routines that served my energy instead of draining it. I stopped being the background stabilizer in someone else's story. I became the author of my own. If there's a lesson in this, it's not about cutting people off or withholding care. It's about recognizing when care has turned into obligation, and obligation has turned into erasure. The reversal happens when you stop negotiating your existence, when you choose consistency over approval, when you let others experience the full weight of their lives without rushing in to catch it. By the time my brother fully understood what he'd lost, he had also gained something. So had I, and neither of us would ever go back. I didn't become someone new overnight. There was no sudden transformation where I woke up stronger, wiser, or immune to doubt. What changed instead was subtler and far more durable. I stopped negotiating with myself about my place in other people's lives. For a long time, my identity had been built around reliability. I was the one who remembered dates, anticipated needs, and softened conflicts before they escalated. I told myself this was kindness, responsibility, love, and some of it was, but hidden beneath that was a quieter truth. I had learned to equate being needed with being valued. Letting go of that belief was uncomfortable. In the beginning, the silence felt unfamiliar. There were fewer calls, fewer assumptions, fewer moments where someone reached for me without thinking. And in that empty space, I had to confront a question I'd avoided for years. Who was I when I wasn't performing usefulness? The answer took time. I noticed how my body felt lighter when my schedule belonged to me. How my thoughts became clearer when they weren't constantly orbiting other people's problems. I began to recognize preferences I'd ignored. How I liked my mornings slow, my evenings quiet, my relationships direct. I learned that calm doesn't have to mean passive, that patience doesn't require self-erasure. My brother and I still speak. Our relationship isn't broken, it's recalibrated. We talk as two adults now, not as a hierarchy disguised as family closeness. There's a respectful distance that allows honesty to exist without resentment. And no, he never formally apologized for saying I wasn't real family. He didn't need to. The apology arrived in behavior, in how he listens now, how he asks instead of assumes, how he no longer places me in roles I didn't choose. Most importantly, I stopped waiting for recognition to grant myself legitimacy. I no longer explain my decisions excessively. I don't rush to justify boundaries. I've learned that people who benefit from your silence will always be confused when you replace it with clarity. That confusion isn't your responsibility. Today my life is quieter, but it's full. I invest energy intentionally. I choose relationships where effort moves in both directions. I still care deeply, but I care without self-sacrifice masquerading as virtue. Quiet dominance isn't about standing above anyone. It's about standing firmly within yourself. I didn't win anything back. I didn't reclaim a position. I reclaimed authorship, and that changed everything. There's a quiet myth many of us grow up believing, that if we are patient enough, helpful enough, undemanding enough, we will eventually be treated with care. That recognition is something earned through endurance. That love, especially within families, is automatic and unconditional, even when respect quietly disappears. This story challenged that myth for me. What I learned, slowly and without drama, is that being present is not the same as being valued, and being silent is not the same as being strong. Strength only becomes real when it includes choice. For a long time, I thought walking away meant abandoning people. I worried that stepping back would make me selfish, cold, or disloyal. But what I discovered was the opposite. When I stopped over-functioning, I allowed others to meet me honestly, or not at all. Both outcomes were informative. My brother didn't become a villain, and I didn't become a hero. There were no winners or losers in the traditional sense. What happened instead was a correction, a rebalancing. The kind that only occurs when one person quietly refuses to continue a role that was never fairly assigned. And here's the part that matters most. I didn't need to be cruel to be firm. I didn't need to punish to protect myself. I simply stopped compensating. That was enough. When someone tells you, directly or indirectly, that you're not real family, what they're often saying is that they don't expect you to leave, that they believe access to you is permanent, regardless of how they treat you. Quiet dominance begins the moment that assumption becomes false, not through threats, not through ultimatums, but through consistency. You show people what access to you actually costs. Some will step up, some will step away. Both are outcomes you can live with once you stop living for approval. Today, my life isn't perfect. I still doubt myself. I still care deeply. But I no longer confuse endurance with love or sacrifice with virtue. I understand now that boundaries aren't walls, they're instructions. They teach people how to be in your life. And if someone refuses to learn, that refusal is an answer. If you've listened this far, maybe parts of this story felt familiar. Maybe you've been the dependable one, the background stabilizer, the person everyone leans on but rarely looks at closely. If that's you, I want you to hear this clearly. Your value does not increase when you disappear into service. It becomes visible when you stop explaining why you deserve space. So I'll end with a question, not to provoke, but to invite reflection. Have you ever realized that the moment you stopped overgiving was the moment others finally had to see you clearly? If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Not your anger, not your revenge fantasies, just your truth. Sometimes quiet stories are the ones that change us the most.